Women on death row, the deadliest among us. When we think of the most dangerous criminals on death row, our minds often jump to ruthless male serial killers, drug lords, and mass murderers. Society has long associated extreme violence with men, believing women to be nurturers, caregivers, and less capable of committing heinous crimes. However, history has repeatedly proven that assumption wrong. Some of the most shocking and brutal crimes have been committed by women, mothers, wives, lovers, and friends, who defied the traditional image of femininity and instead embraced cold-blooded murder. Women on death row are a rare phenomenon. In the United States, for example, only a small percentage of death row inmates are female. As of recent years, fewer than 60 women sit on death row, compared to thousands of men. But does that mean women are less dangerous? Not necessarily. The crimes that have led these women to their fate are often as chilling, if not more so, than those committed by their male counterparts. From poisoning unsuspecting victims to orchestrating brutal killings, their methods of murder reveal cunning, cruelty, and a complete lack of remorse. Consider Lisa Montgomery, a woman who kidnapped a pregnant woman, killed her, and then cut the baby from her womb. Or Christa Pike, the youngest woman in the U.S., sentenced to death for a murder driven by jealousy and sadistic pleasure. And then there's Aileen Wuornos, who gunned down multiple men, claiming self-defense, but leaving behind a trail of victims. These cases prove that women, when driven by rage, greed, or twisted desires, can be just as lethal as any male serial killer. But what makes female killers so terrifying? Is it their ability to blend in, hiding behind the mask of a caring mother, a loving partner, or an innocent-looking girl? Or is it the psychological depth of their crimes, how they manipulate, plan, and execute their killings in ways that shock even the most seasoned investigators? This documentary delves into the most dangerous women on death row, examining their crimes, their motives, and the chilling details of how they ended up awaiting execution. Prepare yourself for a journey into the minds of the deadliest women alive. Judith Neely, the youngest female on death row. A mind twisted by violence, a teenage killer. Like no other, Judith Neely was only 18 years old when she committed a series of brutal crimes that landed her on death row, making her the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States. Her crimes were so horrifying that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend the sheer cruelty behind them. Along with her husband, Alvin Neely, she kidnapped, tortured, and murdered innocent victims in a spree of violence that left deep scars on the small communities of Georgia and Alabama. But what makes Judith's case even more chilling is the role she played in these murders. While many female killers are seen as accomplices or manipulated victims, Judith was the driving force, cold, calculated, and completely remorseless. Her psychological profile paints a picture of a young woman whose mind had been twisted by a toxic mix of abuse, violence, and a thirst for domination. The crimes that shocked a nation. In September 1982, Judith Neely and her husband abducted 13-year-old Lisa Ann Milliken from a Georgia shopping mall. Instead of simply killing her, Judith took her time, torturing the young girl with a needle full of drain cleaner, repeatedly injecting her to prolong her suffering. When that failed to kill Lisa, Judith shot her in the back and dumped her body into a canyon in Alabama. But the horror didn't stop there. Just days later, the Neelys lured a young couple, Janice Chapman and John Hancock, into their trap. While John barely survived the attack, Janice was not so lucky. She was brutally murdered. Judith showed no hesitation, no remorse. It was as if killing had become second nature to her, the mind of a monster, Judith's psychological profile. What turns an 18-year-old girl into a ruthless serial killer? Experts who studied Judith Neely's case believe she was a rare mix of psychopathy and sadism. She wasn't just killing for financial gain or revenge. She seemed to enjoy the suffering of her victims. Several key factors likely contributed to her violent tendencies. 1. Early exposure to violence. Judith had a troubled upbringing, surrounded by crime and instability. She married Alvin Neely, a 26-year-old criminal, when she was just 15. Their relationship quickly turned into a twisted partnership in murder too, manipulation and control. While Alvin was older, Judith was the dominant force in their crimes. She showed no hesitation in leading the torture and killings, proving she was not just an accomplice, but the mastermind. 3. Lack of remorse. Even after her arrest, Judith remained cold and emotionless, showing no regret for what she had done. Instead, she seemed to revel in the chaos she had caused. From death row to life in prison, Judith Neely was sentenced to death in 1983, but in 1999, Alabama's governor commuted her sentence to life in prison, a decision that sparked outrage. Many believed that someone as ruthless as Judith should never be given a chance at life, even behind bars. Today, she remains locked away, a reminder that some of the most dangerous killers aren't always men. Sometimes they come in the form of an 18-year-old girl with a deadly mind and no mercy. Aileen Wuornos, the highway killer, a former prostitute turned serial killer. From a troubled past to a brutal killer. Aileen Wuornos is one of the most infamous female serial killers in American history. Dubbed the Highway Killer, she brutally murdered 7 men between 1989 and 1990. Her case was unique, not only because female serial killers are rare, but because of her disturbing backstory, erratic behavior, and claims that she killed in self-defense. Wuornos wasn't a sadistic killer who enjoyed watching her victims suffer, nor was she a cold-blooded mastermind. Instead, she was a damaged woman, hardened by years of abuse, homelessness, and prostitution. But did her traumatic past justify her crimes? Or was she simply a remorseless predator who used her pain as an excuse to kill? The making of a killer. Aileen Wuornos was born in 1956 in Michigan to an unstable home. Her father was a convicted child molester who hanged himself in prison, and her mother abandoned her when she was just an infant. Raised by her abusive grandparents, Aileen suffered relentless physical and sexual abuse, which led to a lifetime of instability. By her teenage years, she had turned to prostitution to survive, trading sex for food, drugs, and a place to sleep. She lived on the fringes of society, surviving through theft, scams, and sex work. Her hatred for men, particularly those who mistreated her, began to grow. In 1986, she met Tyria Moore, a hotel maid who became her lover. This relationship would be one of the few emotional bonds Wuornos ever formed, but it also played a role in her crimes. Aileen later claimed she killed to provide for herself and Tyria, suggesting that love and survival fueled her rage. The highway murders. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos shot and killed 7 men in Florida. Most were middle-aged, working-class men who had picked her up while she was hitchhiking. Her victims included Richard Mallory, a convicted rapist, according to Wuornos. David Spears, a construction worker, found naked and shot 6 times. Charles Carskadden, a trucker, shot 9 times. Troy Burris, a salesman, shot twice. Charles Dick Humphreys, a retired police chief. Peter Seams, a missionary whose body was never found. Walter Gino Antonio, a trucker, shot 4 times and left on a remote road. Wuornos initially claimed self-defense, stating that these men had either raped or attempted to assault her. However, the excessive force used multiple gunshot wounds. Some in the back cast doubt on her claims. Investigators believe that she lured men under the pretense of prostitution, robbed them, and killed them to eliminate witnesses. Arrest and confession. Aileen Wuornos was arrested in January 1991 after police linked her to the stolen vehicles and possessions of her victims. But the final blow came when Tyria Moore cooperated with the police, convincing Wuornos to confess in a recorded phone call. Wuornos admitted to the killings but insisted she had acted in self-defense. Her erratic behavior, violent outbursts in court, and deep mistrust of lawyers and the justice system made her trial one of the most bizarre in history. In 1992, she was sentenced to death. She later pleaded guilty to additional murders, stating, "I'd kill again. I hate humans. Psychological profile. Victim or predator." Aileen Wuornos' case is complex and controversial. Many believe she was a product of extreme abuse, a woman who had suffered at the hands of men her entire life and finally fought back. Others argue that she was a cold-blooded predator who used her tragic past as an excuse to kill psychologists, diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, making her prone to impulsivity, aggression. Christa Pike, the satanic murderer, the youngest woman, sentenced to death in the U.S., a teenage killer. Obsessed with Satanism at just 18 years old, Christa Pike became the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States. Her crime? A brutal, sadistic murder fueled by jealousy, obsession, and a fascination with Satanism. Unlike many other female killers, Christa did not kill for financial gain, revenge, or self-defense. She killed for the thrill of it. Her case shocked the nation, not just because of her age, but because of the sheer cruelty of the crime. Christa Pike and her accomplices tortured and murdered 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer, leaving behind evidence so disturbing that even hardened detectives struggled to process the scene. But what drove a teenage girl to commit such a heinous act? Was it pure evil, or was she a victim of her own dark influences? The brutal murder of Colleen Slemmer in 1995, Christa Pike was a troubled teen attending a job training program in Knoxville, Tennessee, run by the Job Corps. It was here that she met Daryl Shipp, a 17-year-old boy who would become her boyfriend and partner in crime. The two shared a deep obsession with Satanism, often talking about rituals, sacrifices, and death. Their victim, Colleen Slemmer, was a fellow student at the Job Corps program. Christa believed Colleen was trying to steal Tatterall from her, and this jealousy quickly turned into deadly rage. Along with another friend, Shadala Peterson, Christa and Tatterall lured Colleen into a secluded area on January 12, 1995. For the next 30 minutes, Colleen was tortured mercilessly. Christa and Tatterall beat, slashed, and carved a pentagram into her chest. As Colleen begged for her life, Christa laughed and taunted her, saying, "It's too late now." Finally, Christa crushed Colleen's skull with a large rock, ensuring she was dead. But the most disturbing part? Christa kept a piece of Colleen's skull as a souvenir, showing it off to her friends as if it were a trophy. Arrest and chilling confession, it didn't take long for authorities to catch Christa Pike. She boasted about the murder to multiple people, even carrying Colleen's skull fragment around in her jacket pocket. Police quickly arrested Christa, Tatterall, and Shadala. During questioning, Christa showed no remorse, even laughing about the murder. She openly admitted to the killing and described the attack in chilling detail. Her disturbing lack of guilt and enthusiasm for violence made her stand out even among the most dangerous criminals. In 1996, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, making her the youngest woman on death row in the United States. Daryl Shipp, being a minor, received a life sentence, while Shadala Peterson, who played a lesser role, got probation in exchange for testimony. Inside the mind of Christa Pike, Christa's psychological profile reveals a mix of sadism, narcissism, and deep-seated anger. Experts believe her troubled childhood, exposure to abuse, and involvement in satanic rituals may have fueled her violent tendencies. However, her lack of remorse and enjoyment of the crime set her apart from other teenage offenders. Her behavior didn't stop behind bars. In 2001, she attempted to strangle a fellow inmate with a shoelace, further proving her violent nature still awaiting execution. Despite being sentenced to death in 1996, Christa Pike remains on death row to this day. Numerous appeals have delayed her execution, but she remains one of the most notorious female killers in U.S. history. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters come in the most unexpected forms, even in the form of an 18-year-old girl with a deadly obsession and no mercy. Other infamous cases, women whose crimes shocked the world. While Christa Pike, Aileen Wuornos, and Judith Neely are among the most notorious women on death row, they are not alone. Throughout history, several women have committed crimes so gruesome and shocking that they defied society's perception of women as nurturers. These cases reveal that evil knows no gender, and when women kill, they can be just as cold, calculated, and ruthless as any male serial killer. Here are some of the most infamous female criminals who left a trail of terror in their wake. Griselda Blanco, the cocaine queen of Miami crime. Drug trafficking, multiple murders. Sentence, killed in 2012. Not on death row, Griselda Blanco was one of the most feared women in the history of organized crime. Known as the Black Widow, she orchestrated over 200 murders while running a multi-billion-dollar drug empire. During the Miami drug wars of the 1970s and 1980s, she ordered brutal killings without hesitation, often targeting rivals, former lovers, and even innocent bystanders. Unlike most female criminals who kill out of passion or revenge, Blanco was a calculating and ruthless mastermind. She revolutionized the cocaine trade, smuggling drugs into the U.S. and eliminating anyone who stood in her way. Her legacy of violence ended in 2012 when she was assassinated in Colombia. 2. Dorothea Puente, the killer landlady crime, murdering elderly tenants for financial gain, sentence, life imprisonment. Dorothea Puente seemed like an innocent elderly landlady, but behind her kind demeanor was a cold-blooded killer. Throughout the 1980s, she lured vulnerable people, often elderly or mentally ill, into her boarding house, promising them care and shelter. Instead, she drugged and killed them, burying their bodies in her backyard. While continuing to cash their Social Security checks, authorities discovered 7 bodies on her property, though she was suspected of many more murders. Despite her crimes, Puente never showed remorse and insisted she was innocent. She died in prison in 2011. Between 1998 and 2006, she strangled and beat dozens of elderly women in their homes. Her motive? A deep hatred for older women, stemming from childhood abuse by her mother. Disguising herself as a social worker, Barraza would gain the trust of her elderly victims before brutally killing them. Her reign of terror ended in 2006 when she was caught fleeing the scene of a murder. She was sentenced to an astonishing 759 years in prison, ensuring she would never walk free again. Miyuki Ishikawa, the angel of death crime, mass murder of infants. Sentence, light prison sentence, released early. Miyuki Ishikawa was a midwife in post-war Japan, but instead of saving lives, she murdered over 100 infants by neglecting them. Operating under the belief that poor families could not care for their newborns, she let them die from starvation and neglect, all while taking money from desperate parents who wanted to get rid of their babies. Despite being responsible for one of the worst cases of serial infanticide, she received only a light prison sentence. Many argued that her punishment was too lenient, as society at the time viewed her actions as a twisted form of mercy, killing Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood. The murderous lover's crime, killing elderly nursing home patients. Sentence, life in prison. For Graham, 20 years for Wood. This case involved a disturbing duo of lovers who worked at a Michigan nursing home in the 1980s. Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood turned murder into a twisted game, smothering elderly patients while engaging in a sick form of sexual bonding. Their method was chilling. They picked victims based on the letters of their names so that their killings would spell out words. While Graham did most of the actual murders, Wood later testified against her, claiming she was manipulated into participating. Graham received life in prison, while Wood served only 20 years before being released in 2019. Jodi Arias, the jealous lover who stabbed 27 times crime. Murder of her ex-boyfriend, Travis Alexander. Sentence, life imprisonment. Jodi Arias's case became one of the most sensationalized murder trials in recent U.S. history. In 2008, she brutally stabbed her ex-boyfriend, Travis Alexander, 27 times, slit his throat, and shot him in the head. Her motive? Jealousy and obsession. During her trial, Arias changed her story multiple times, initially claiming innocence, then saying it was self-defense, and finally admitting to the murder but blaming it on Travis's abuse. The jury didn't buy her excuses, and she was sentenced to life without parole. Her manipulative personality, obsessive behavior, and complete lack of remorse made her one of the most notorious female killers in modern history. Conclusion: the dark side of women who kill these women prove that serial murder, sadistic killings, and violent crimes are not just committed by men. Whether motivated by power, jealousy, greed, or twisted pleasure, Each of these killers shattered societal expectations about women and crime. Some, like Griselda Blanco, killed for control. Others, like Dorothea Puente, murdered for financial gain. And then, there were those like Juana Barraza and Christa Pike, whose deep-seated rage led them to commit horrifying acts of violence. Regardless of their motives, one thing remains clear. When women kill, their crimes can be just as brutal, calculated, and shocking as any of history's most infamous male murderers. Understanding justice and the psychology of female killers. Throughout history, society has viewed women as nurturers, caregivers, and protectors of life. This perception makes female killers particularly shocking. They challenge everything we expect about gender and violence. While male killers often dominate headlines, cases like Aileen Wuornos, Christa Pike, and Judith Neely prove that women are just as capable of committing cold-blooded and sadistic murders. But what makes these women kill? Is it nature or nurture? Are they born evil, or do circumstances shape them into killers? The answer is complex. Unlike male serial killers, who often kill for power, sexual gratification, or thrill, female killers typically murder for revenge, financial gain, jealousy, or emotional reasons. However, as seen in cases like Christa Pike and Juana Barraza, some women kill simply for pleasure and control, showing a disturbing lack of empathy. The role of abuse and trauma. One common factor among many female killers is childhood trauma and abuse. Aileen Wuornos, for example, was raped, beaten, and abandoned before turning to prostitution and eventually murder. Similarly, Judith Neely was exposed to violence from a young age, which may have influenced her actions. However, not every abused person becomes a killer. So what makes the difference? Psychologists believe that some women develop antisocial or psychopathic traits, making them manipulative, remorseless, and violent. Others, like Dorothea Puente, may lack conscience entirely, killing for personal gain without guilt. These cases suggest that both psychological disorders and life experiences play a role in shaping a female murderer justice for the victims. While some of these killers were sentenced to death, others received lighter punishments due to gender biases in the justice system. Historically, women have been viewed as less dangerous than men, leading to more lenient sentences. However, as society becomes more aware of female-perpetrated violence, the justice system is changing. Cases like Jodi Arias and Christa Pike prove that when women commit brutal murders, they are just as deserving of severe punishment as men. In the end, these killers are not anomalies. They are reminders that evil exists in all forms. While understanding their psychology may help prevent future crimes, justice must always prioritize the victims. Because no matter who the killer is, murder should never go unanswered.